This event is part of the GeoPost's ongoing efforts to tackle disinformation and promote fact-based journalism. As one of the leading platforms dedicated to exposing misinformation, the GeoPost has organized several key discussions on this topic, bringing together experts, policymakers, and media professionals to find solutions. To officially open the Balkan Disinfo 2025, I'm pleased to invite to the stage Gunnar Van Hari, the CEO of the GeoPost.
Such an honor to be with all your friends who support me these 2 weeks.
Të cilët më kanë mbështetur gjatë këtyre 2 javëve për të organizuar këtë konferencë. Ishte shumë sfiduese gjatë këtyre 2 javëve puna që e bëm, por ne vazhdojmë dhe ja ku jemi, falë mbështetjes suaj dhe jam shumë krenar që kam krijuar mbicë anë mban botës dhe ju uroj mirëseardhje këtu në Prishtinë, në Kosovë. Atëherë le të fillojmë me konferencën. Kemi folës të mrekullueshëm, profesionistë të fushës. Dhe në fund ajo që është më e rëndësishme ja kemi bërë bashkë kaq shumë njerëz të mirë në këtë konferencë të GeoPostit për herë të dytë. Ju faleminderit dhe mirë se vini. Tani kemi kënaqësinë të ftojmë Alen Musafendiq, që është shef i Task Force-s për Ballkanin Perëndimor në kuadër të divizionit të komunikimit strategjik të shërbimit evropian të veprimit të jashtëm në Bruksel. Ai na bashkangjitet online. Ky shërbim ka punuar në mënyrë aktive për t'ju kundërvënë dezinformimin në mbar Evropën, duke përfshirë në Ballkanin Perëndimor dhe këto përpjekje luajnë rol kyç për të adresuar përhapjen e informacionit të rrem dhe ndikimin që ka në shoqëri. Alen, e ke fjalën. Faleminderit shumë. Përshëndetje nga Brukseli. Fatkeqësisht unë nuk mund të vija, por edhe kjo kryen punë. Ju lutem më sinjalizoni nëse mund ta shihni prezantimin tim, nga se unë i kam disa slajde që dua t'i ndaj me ju, po mund ta shohim. Faleminderit. Atëherë, siç është thënë, unë jam në krye të ekipit në shërbimin evropian të veprimit të jashtëm. Për ata që nuk e dini, është krahu diplomatik i BE-s dhe ne jemi vënë në kundërvënie të dezinformimit nga viti 2015 si divizion, por për Ballkanin jemi duke u angazhuar nga viti 2018 dhe në fund të fundit në këtë shërbim kemi kolegë që punojnë në mënyrë të dedikuar për Rusinë, Task Force e lindjes dhe kemi divizionin për lindjen e mesme dhe një task force për Afrikën subsahariane, për shkak se ky do të jetë një prioritet në të ardhmen, nga se Afrika është lënë anësh me kalimin e viteve sa i përket kësaj fushe. Atëherë do t'ju tregoj se çfarë është qasja e BE-s, se si i qasemi dezinformimit dhe çfarë bëjmë Ballkanin Perëndimor. Atëherë jo që të jem tepër dramatik, por ja se si ne e shohim dezinformimin apo manipulimin dhe ndërhyrjen në informacion nga aktorët e huaj, jo që jeni të fushës e njihni këtë terminologji, e quajmë shkurtëfimi, por ne përqendrohemi te sjelljet në radhë të parë. Dhe në këtë metaforë, nëse shikojmë individin ose fishekun individual si narrativ, atëherë kjo nuk kupton që nuk mund ta ndalni, t'ia preni rrugën secilit fishek, është krejtësisht e pamundur. Por me kalimin e kohës ka ndryshuar edhe qasja. Fillimisht jemi kundërvënë narrativave me kundër narrativa. Ju duhet fishek tjetër, ju duhet ushtar, ju duhet një armat, ju duhet infrastrukturë. Për këtë arsye, me kalimin e kohës jemi përqendruar te niveli sistemik infrastrukturor, në mënyrë që të mund t'i kundërvijemi dezinformimit nga Rusia apo diku tjetër, dhe kjo metaforë për shembull na tregon se si Rusia e sheh makinën e tyre propagandistike si një mjet për për aftësitë e tyre defanzive apo më mirë themi ofanzive. Për ne, kjo është një çështje e sigurisë natyrisht. Atëherë kush e lufton fimin nga ana e PS? Nuk kemi të bëjmë vetëm me shërbimin e veprimit të jashtëm, por ne në të vërtetë krekosemi se jemi pionjer nga se kemi filluar të parët dhe shumë prej terminologjisë dhe metodologjisë që përdoret anë mban PS ka zanafillën të ne. Natyrisht që kemi kolegë edhe në komision me strategji të tyre të komunikimit dhe aftësi të tjera. Pastaj kemi partnerët tanë ndërkombëtar, gështat e NATO, shoqëria civile luan rol të rëndësishëm. Kjo është posaçërisht me rëndësi në Ballkanin Perëndimor, do të flas më shumë për këtë më vonë, dhe industria private ose sektori privat është me rëndësi, nga se do të flasim se si në këtë sektori kemi platformat e mëdha si Meta dhe platforma X, pa të cilët nuk mund të arrijmë asgjë në afat të gjatë. Dhe natyrisht e dini që bashkëpunimi ka pasur pika kulmore e të ulëta me kalimin e kohës. Nuk është me rëndësi ta lexojmë këtë slajd, është aty vetëm si ilustrativ për kronologjinë. Ka pasur plane veprimi kundër disinformimit ose plane tematike të përqendruara kryesisht rreth Covidit, por nga këto do të thosha që akti i shërbimeve digjitale nga viti 2022 është akti më i rëndësishëm në kuptim të akteve legjislative për t'ju kundërvënë dezinformimit në kuptim të fimit. Shumica natyrisht që i njihni këto vijat e trasha, kështu që nuk do të hyj në hollësi. Ambicia kryesore e aktit të shërbimeve digjitale është që ambienti digital të jetë sa më i ngjashëm me atë që kemi në botën reale. Natyrisht që të pajtohemi që bota reale, jeta reale nuk është e përkryer, por njerëzit kanë tendencë të jenë më njerëzor, më të kulturuar kur flasin drejt për drejt. Para këtij akti ka qenë pak a shumë si perëndimi i egër në kohën e pushtimit të perëndimit amerikan. Në kuptim të mungesës së llogaridhënies dhe pikqyrjes, ajo që është arritur pas aktit është që të kemi më shumë pikqyrje, në mënyrë që të kemi më shumë llogaridhënie brenda platformave dhe ende ka shumë sfida kundrejt disa platformave të caktuara, për shembull X, dhe ka disa hetime që janë duke u kryer në kuadër të aktit të shërbimeve digjitale, epilogu i të cilave është i panjohur, madje i të cilëve hetime është i panjohur madje edhe për mua, por është me rëndësi që të mbajmë hapin dhe të jemi të vetëdijshëm për këto. Atëherë kjo është kutia e veglave që e përdorim, ndërgjegjësimi sipas situatës, në mënyrë që ta dimë se çfarë po ndodh. Dhe kjo nuk kupton vetëm mbledhjen e informacionit, por kupton edhe kategorizimin e informacionit sipas taksonomisë së caktuar dhe metodologjisë së caktuar që na e bën të mundur që ta ndajmë me partnerët tanë. Për këtë arsye ne punojmë në bashkëpunim me partnerë të ndryshëm anë mbar botës në mënyrë që të parafrojmë metodologjitë në mënyrë të tërësjellë. Ndërtimi i reziliencës është një gjë tjetër që e bëjmë ne në Ballkanin Perëndimor. Lidhëm, i bëjmë bashkë organizata nga rajon dhe nga rajoni në Bruksel, kryejmë trajnime, organizojmë konferenca si kjo që keni ju. Çrregullimi në të vërtetë ky është një emërtim jo fort i mirë për atë që nuk kupton këtu. Kjo është të vërtetë një farë lloj ndërhyrje legjislative si për akti për shërbimet digjitale dhe pastaj kemi kundërpërgjigje diplomatike. Kjo nuk kupton se ne mund të dërgojmë mesazhe diplomatike, por edhe të imponojmë masa kufizuese dhe sanksione siç kemi vepruar disa herë. Atëherë platforma jonë kryesore është EU vs Disinfo, BE-ja kundër dezinformimit. Nëse nuk e keni vizituar, ju ftoj ta bëni. Është databaza më e madhe në dispozicion publik për disinformimin pro Kremlin, por nuk kemi vetëm këto, kemi dezinformim nga vendet e ndryshme të botës dhe aktorët e ndryshëm. Me rrezikshmëri dhe kemi mbi 17.000 raste të kategorizuara, kemi ulëmtime, kemi videolojra dhe burime të ndryshme. Çfarë bëjmë ne ekspozojmë operacionet e tipit fimi. Këtë që e shihni këtu para jush është në të vërtetë një operacion që e quajmë fasada e rreme dhe këtë e kemi bërë me kolegët në Spanjë, qeverinë spanjolle. Kemi bashkëpunuar në këtë drejtim, masat kufizuese. Është një mjet shumë i rëndësishëm, i kemi përdorur kundër të gjitha për shembull shtëpive kryesore mediatike ruse dhe edhe ndaj individëve këtu mund të shihni Maria Zakharovan, që është zëdhënëse e Ministrisë së Jashtme ruse dhe poshtë shihni Margarita Simonyan, shefën e RT Balkan, kërkoj falje, RT Global dhe RT Balkan është nën sanksione tashmë, por siç e dini sigurisht ende është në dispozicion dhe lish transmeton nga Beogradi për rajonin dhe jo vetëm kaq, por RT Balkan ka filluar të transmetojë edhe si një TV kanal, pra sanksionet nuk po respektohen, që është çështje që gjallë shqetësim. Është fatkeqe kjo për shkak se në një sër rastesh të gjithë liderët e Ballkanit, liderët politik të Ballkanit janë zotuar që të punojnë më shumë për të luftuar fimin dhe dezinformimin, për shembull në vitin 2002 në samitin e Ballkanit Perëndimor në Tiranë, në Shqipëri. Në konkluza është pika 25 që thonë që ne zotohemi të luftojmë fimin. Edhe kjo vlen edhe për liderët e BE-s dhe ata të Ballkanit Perëndimor, por jo vetëm kaq, nga viti 2023 gjithashtu është pjesë e procesit për aderim në BE, pra që përvetësohet fimi, është një rrisi, themi që si pjesë e procesit për aderim në BE, vendet kandidate që janë shumica e vendeve në Ballkanin Perëndimor janë të detyruara që të bëjnë më shumë për të ngushtuar hapësirën për hapjen e fimi. Dhe dua ta përmend shpejt edhe këtë, çdo gjë që imagjinoni se e bëjnë ne në Ballkan, ne në të vërtetë e bëjmë, mbështesim raportimin në të gjitha vendet, 6 vendet e Ballkanit Perëndimor, dhe jemi ndër organizatat e para që mbështesin raportimet e raportet që japin sugjerime për politika që identifikojnë kërcënimet, mbështesim organizatat të shoqërisë civile, organizojmë konferenca e shihni këtu Kristiana Manpur, e cila na është bashkëngjitur online fare shpejt pas pushtimit të Ukrainës. Ne ishim në Sarajevo, ajo ishte në Kiev. Kjo është një pikë e rëndësishme. Jemi pjesë e ekipit Stratcom, pra jo vetëm që e kundërvihemi fimin, por merremi edhe me anën tjetër të monedhës, pra në mënyrë proaktive pozicionohemi si BE dhe pro BE-s në mënyrë që aktorët e kërcënimit të mos mund të mbjellin narrativa të rreme. Ja se kemi ndihmuar i shefi tonë Josep Borrell, sot është Kaja Kallas, shefi jona, vetëm disa ditë pas pushtimit të shkallë të gjerë të Ukrainës. I kemi ndihmuar përfaqësuesit të lartë të hartojnë një artikull i cili është publikuar në anën e parë rajonit fare shpejt pas pushtimit, në mënyrë që njerëzit banorët e Ballkanit Perëndimor ta dinë se çfarë është qëndrimi i BE-s për këtë pushtim. Sa i përket konferencave, desha që ta përmend këtë, nga se vitin e kaluar kishim një moment piket për ne dhe Prishtinën, e shihni konferencën e edukimit mediatik Majtas që organizon një herë vet në një vend të Ballkanit Perëndimor, dhe audiencë target e kemi partnerët rajonal, ata të cilët punojnë për t'ju kundërvënë disinformimit dhe fimit, dhe kemi përsëri një fotografi gjatas nga Prishtina në tetor të vitit që shkoi, ku kemi konferencën e bërjes bashkë të komuniteteve mediatike, gazetarëve pra dhe mediave nga Barklopi, diku 130 sosh u bën bashkë në Prishtinë në tetor të vitit projektit që shkoi nga Afrika e deri në Azi, duke përfshirë Evropën. Dhe unë mendoj se ishte një aktivitet shumë i suksesshëm. Edhe në fund, vetëm një shembull se si ne mbështesim projektet e ndryshme. Ky është projekti për pronësinë e mediave. Është në dispozicion online ky informacion, ju ftoj ta vizitoni. Një aspekt i rëndësishëm i punës që e bëjmë ne është të promovojmë transparencën sa i përket pronësisë së mediave në Ballkanin Perëndimor. Ju faleminderit shumë për vëmendjen dhe po e përmbyll këtu.
Thank you, Mr. Musafendic, for insights.
Faleminderit zotrin Musafendic për mirë shënova shkënqetet. Tani vazhdojmë tutje panelin e parë. Kemi dezinformimin transatlantik në mes të BE-s dhe SBA-s.
And transatlantic relations. And this panel was eager to share their experience and research
Reprezentuesit do të ndajnë informacione dhe vërtime të tyre në këtë çështje. Diskutimi do të moderohet nga Xhelal Neziri. Zotri Neziri, merr fjalën.
I have to invite another guest.
Më duhet të ftoj Benjamin Schultz nga Shërbimin, Bengraham nga Britania dhe Katrina Glingova.
Thank you, Hillary.
Faleminderit.
Thank you, Guinan, for this conference. Without your efforts to continue the tradition to organize this conference, wouldn't be reality today. So thank you to you. Ladies and gentlemen, distinguished guests, esteemed panelists, it's my pleasure to open the conference and to welcome you today to the first panel of the Geo Post-Annual Conference, titled as Transatlantic Disinformation. As the title of the panel suggests, this is a challenge that continues to shape our political landscape, social cohesion and democratic institutions on both sides of the Atlantic. Russia, China and Iran continues to pose significant risk to the Western democracies by attempting to shape public opinion through disinformation, aiming to divert them from their strategic goal and being part of the Western world. On the other side of the Atlantic, since the new administration took power in the United States, many questions have arisen regarding to its global role. Can the US withdraw from its position as a guardian of the rules-based world order, or will act in different form? What will the world look like after Trump's return to the office? What challenges will the EU and UK face in the coming period regarding to the war in Ukraine and efforts to combat disinformation? What role can NATO play in addressing these issues? This is some of the key questions that we will try to explore and to discuss with our esteemed panelists. So let's dive into the discussion. I will start with Katarina Glingova. She's Senior Research Fellow at the Center for Democracy and Resilience at Globsec International think tank based in Bratislava. Since 2016, she has led research on information operation, hybrid threats, and social resilience, as well as capacity building projects on public administration vulnerabilities and strategic communication. Previously, she worked for Transparency International Slovakia and the European Commission. So my first question to you is, how has disinformation evolved in the recent years in USA and Europe as Western world? And what do you see in your research as growing trends in this regard?
Thank you very much. Good morning, everybody. Thank you very much for the organizer for the opportunity to be here and speak at this distinguished panel. In my work, we do not really focus that much on the disinformation that is being spread in the United States. I think that Ben, I have two Bens, it's easy to remember, as my co-speakers, will definitely address that. But we studied, after the annexation of Crimea back in 2014, we really saw in Central Europe that from one day to another, certain outlets that, for example, previously focused on sports or culture, switched from one day to another their agenda and started to spread pro-Kremlin propaganda. In order to find out how widespread that propaganda was, we started to conduct our own public opinion polls titled Globes of Trends to find out how impactful these narratives are on public perceptions. This is 2024 version, but we already collected the data for the 2025 version. And what we're observing is, and when it comes to the question of the general trends, the general trend is that while back in 2014, 2015, disinformation were at the outskirts of our societies, at the outskirts of information environment, now the disinformation are being spread and voiced by our political leaders. It's not something that you have to seek on various dubious websites or closed-door Facebook channels, Twitter channels, and stuff like that. It's being voiced or being voiced by our political leadership. You switch on TV, you switch on major political debates prior to elections or after elections, and you have polarizing narratives being voiced by various stakeholders. You have smear campaigns targeting civil society organizations, investigative journalists. You have disinformation being spread by our allies, or institutions as the European Union and NATO. And then you have you have domestic actors in Central Europe that are eventually spreading pro-Kremlin narratives or narratives that are undermining the war in Ukraine and the support of EU and NATO towards Ukraine. So that's one of the biggest trends, because it really affects public perceptions. From our public opinion polls, we see that depending on the narrative, you have 66% of Slovaks in 2023 thought that US is trying to drag him into the war in Ukraine. At the moment, still majority of Central Eastern Europeans perceive Russia as a security threat. But that perception in Slovakia has decreased from 62% in 2022 to 49% in 2024. You have from 20% to 40% of respondents in Central Eastern European countries increasingly perceiving that Western societies and their life of living are perceived as a security threat or a threat to their traditional values and perceptions. So it's not just something that is, those narratives and polarizing narratives are not something that is connected to geopolitics, but they're addressing every single aspect of our society. So during the pandemic, we had a huge invasion of disinformation about pandemic that went hand in hand with the promotion that countries like China and Russia were very efficient in handling the pandemic and vaccination, while Europe was completely failing in it. And in this case, during the pandemic, we really saw that some of the disinformation narratives that were being spread and that were originated from the United States were then 2 months later being repeated and amplified by various actors in Central Europe. You had videos like, share with little labels like, this was banned in America, share it before it's going to be banned so that you know the truth about the vaccination. And it's a community, we see it, because during the pandemic, the same actors that were spreading anti-vaccination narratives became, with the full-scale invasion, experts on war in Ukraine, and then experts on energy security. So it's the same networks What it's problematic is that these, usually the term is being used, the Kremlin playbook is increasingly being used not only by Kremlin, but also by Chinese and other authoritarian actors, but increasingly also by domestic representatives in European countries. You have, I'm coming from Slovakia, we have so many things that are happening in our country, but you have an increasing number of disinformation being spread by my government, by Hungarians. So it's domestic, it's here, and it's really destroying our democracy and polarizing our societies.
Thank you. Just a short, I want a short answer from you. Does the collective memory of the Central European state that now are part of NATO and EU play some role in regard of Russian influence? Because after the Second World War, they were suppressed by the Soviet Union dictatorship, and maybe that collective memory is still alive, or what is the role of that part of history in shaping of today's public opinion in
it very much differs. It differs from country to country, but first of all, you have to understand that a lot of Central Eastern Europeans are disillusioned with democracy, because the promises that were being voiced by political leadership in the 90s of having a Swiss wages, everybody living very comfortably, they were never fulfilled. Democracy is not a checklist. Democracy is not your country becoming the member of the European Union and EU and NATO is going to fix everything for yourself. And this disillusionment, this skewed perception of what does it mean to be part of EU and NATO was and is being utilized by various actors. The drivers of the Kremlin propaganda, and soft power, it very much differs from country to country. When we did public opinion polls, specifically asking on these types of things back in 2022, we found out that 78% of Slovaks thought that Russians are their traditional Slavic brothers. In case of Serbia, that was over 90%. Similarly, in Bulgaria, you have this pan-Slavism being voiced and promoted by various actors, including the Russian embassies. At every single commemoration of the end of the Second World War or, Slovak national uprising, you have these actors that keep on reminding that we defeated the fascism in Europe. In my country, you have political leaders during the, voicing it even now, but also predominantly before the parliamentary elections, saying to hundreds of people, said that nothing ever good has come to Slovakia from the West, only war and fascism, and peace and stability has come to Slovakia only from East. So you have this very systematic work and framing of history being utilized both by Kremlin and Kremlin-affiliated institutions, actors, which are then being taken over and amplified by domestic actors. And you have, in case of Hungary, you see this promotion of cooperation with Hungary, especially when it comes to economy, big economic projects. So it very much depends. In Bulgaria, it's the impact, not only in Bulgaria, but like in Bulgaria, Serbia, it's the impact of the Orthodox Church that has a huge influence on the public perceptions and how we perceive or how the citizens of respective countries perceive Russia. So it's utilization of our own vulnerabilities. For example, when we started this monitoring, we noticed that I know I'm cutting it, but like a lot of disinformation in Slovakia were focusing on being anti-American, being anti-NATO, trying to foster narratives that, NATO is just it's a puppet of America. In case of Czech Republic, a lot of those narratives were focusing on European Union because of the traditional Eurosceptic perception that were being voiced by the Czech leaders. In case of Poland, where Polish Poles know and have known for a very long time, like, who's the threat. They've been invaded by the Russians, and they know that they're the enemy #1 for them. But a lot of those narratives that you could see were narratives that were driving internal polarization, trying to push forward negative perceptions of Ukraine, negative perceptions of Jews, even before the full-scale invasion. So we have to understand that information operations have been happening for years, and it's a long-term systematic act, and this will not change from one day to another. The problem is that a lot of domestic actors are now taking over these narratives, and institutions are not actually reacting to it. I think that our reaction is a bit slow.
Thank you, Katarina. The next panelist is Ben Graham Jones. I have spelled correctly your name. Just to say a few words about you, a short bio. He is a consultant specializing in emerging challenges to election integrity, with experience in over 30 elections observation, assistance, and advisory missions. He has served in roles such as head of mission, media and social media analyst, and online campaign analyst. He has advised senior leaders, including former heads of the government. Ben holds degrees from University of Cambridge and King's College London's Department of War Studies, and he's a Churchill Fellow. So the floor is yours. I mean, the same question about the trends from UK perspective.
I think it's easy, faced with the challenges that we face, to strike a note of pessimism, and I'm sure there'll be plenty of that today. But I'd like to take a moment to also reflect on the progress, the huge progress I think we have made in this great collective challenge that we face. If last year was the year of elections, this must be the year of learning from elections. We have enormous swathes of analysis that was done in the different countries where elections took place last year. And I think now part of the challenge must be to really take a moment to look through all that and really understand where are we as a field and how can we move forward with courage and ambition. So perhaps just a couple of areas where I feel we have made some progress. And the first really is on that evidential basis. There are some fantastic evidential reviews out there which sum up really some of the main findings that we are learning about how to counter disinformation more effectively, from Carnegie Endowment, from USAID, from other organizations, and this I think is providing a much stronger basis for us to be able to do the work we need to do moving forward. And secondly, I think there's an increasing degree of strategic alignment among certain key actors about the nature of the response. We understand that needs to be a whole society response. And we're sat here at an event, if I may say so, which has been made possible by the diplomatic community, by local CSOs, by a local taxi company, by our local businesses, and really that to me is sort of sums up the essence of what that is: winning new allies, building new coalitions in terms of that fight against information manipulation and those who try to manipulate and divide our democracies. Thirdly, we've got very tangible mechanisms of transnational resilience which have been developed. Things like the means of information sharing, common typologies like the disarm framework, common repositories like OpenCTI. These types of approaches, what they're doing is they are making it easier to share data across national frontiers so that we can understand the threat at a global level. And that's important because a lot of the actors who are trying to slice and dice information are operating on a transnational level. So, there's some reason, I think, for some optimism, despite the challenges that we face. But I do want to take a moment, if I may, very briefly, to underscore some of those challenges as far as I see. Now, a lot of my work focuses on particularly United Front efforts, so China's overseas and domestic information operations. And what we see is an increasing degree of strategic alignment in the efforts of our adversaries. We see the amplification of pro-Russian narratives, for example, by PRC networks. And this increasing alignment, I think, is a message to us that we too need to work ever closer together in response. Secondly, it feels to me that we still haven't quite got off the back foot. Sometimes our field, it can feel like being stuck in a castle under siege, and our response to that siege is to increase the production of shields, which is sort of, great temporarily, but it doesn't help you win back the territory taken by those who try to manipulate information. So I think looking at the underlying causes of why, the psychological reasons why people buy in to disinformation, how do you win back those hearts and minds? We know that it's emotions that motivate behavior change. And so thinking about how to make that positive argument and fill that gap of meaning that people seek for when they buy into these radical narratives, I think is a question we still haven't quite achieved an answer to as our global community. Fundamentally, these actors try to instrumentalize freedom of expression to violate freedom of thought, and making the argument for why we need to protect those freedoms, I think, is something we can do with greater eloquence. So those are roughly on a global level where I think we see where I see the status quo. Maybe later we can get into talking about some of the specific elections or some of the specific challenges that we faced. So I'd say it's a mixed picture, and I would encourage all of us to think forward and not just buy into the and not just think through the negatives and the challenges, the obvious challenges that we are facing at this current moment in time.
From your experience in election integrity, how does Russia, China, and other countries that practice that malignant influence in UK particularly, can shape their opinion that after that can be crucial for the voters how to vote and who to vote?
So one crucial point, and we saw this in the UK election, is that tactics that are deployed by hostile actors have often already been deployed in other geographies, which is why that collaboration is so important. So, for example, as part of Doppelganger, an information operation, there was a tactic that was deployed in the UK election of using AI to generate a fake media source. It was called the London Crier, which distributed false narratives. That was then amplified actually by the Russian embassy in South Africa and attributed to British media. Now, this sort of false attribution through sort of a third party is actually something that's been done for, yes, it's been done by Russian-linked actors in recent years, but it's been done for a decade by United Front bodies. And so this is why if when we're preparing for resilience in advance of an election, if our point of reference is the previous election 4 years ago or 5 years ago, or in some contexts 7 years ago, then we are always going to be outdated. We're always going to be on the back foot, which is why fora like this, where those of us from lots of different contexts and lots of different organizations come together to share that insight and to share that understanding, is so important, so that we can have an up-to-date, forward-thinking response. So that was an example from the UK election, but working on many elections across the world each year, you see so many of these tactics re-emerging, and so often actors are unprepared because they're looking back at 4 or 5 years ago and not at the election that took place on the other side of the world 3 weeks ago, 4 weeks ago, where you'll see the latest and emerging tactics to manipulate information.
Thank you, Ben. The next panelist is Mr. Benjamin Schultz. He's a researcher and an expert in digital governance, foreign influence campaigns, and the regulation of the social media platforms. His work focuses on the ethics of emerging technologies, strengthening democratic resilience, and promoting media literacy to counter disinformation. He also analyzes digitalization of organized crime, recruitment, and its impact on security. Schultz's expertise expands on NATO, European, and transatlantic relations, where he examines geopolitical dimensions of digital strategy. So the same question about the trends, and the second question, how we can use the new digital tools, AI or other technical tools to combat disinformation in this age.
Well, I hate to be the pessimist, but because Ben, you presented such a good positive outlook, and we discussed this over lunch yesterday. It turned into a very pessimistic rant from me. So sorry to turn it back to that. But coming from the States, I certainly agree with what both of you have said. The call is coming from inside the house now in terms of domestic amplification and spread of disinformation. But also there are some bright notes emerging in our civil society, kind of a resistance to that. Overall, I will say, certainly in the last 2 weeks, I don't think I have to really go into it, but a lot has changed in the States and in the whole world due to the various executive orders and whatnot. And in the States, one particularly troubling trend that has been kind of percolating for a while, that has really been launched into overdrive, is attacks on researchers and attacks on research and science itself. In just the last week, we've seen public universities across the US be sued or otherwise have to deal with legal action for simply hosting researchers who have worked on digital governance, AI technology, disinformation. We've seen nonprofit organizations such as where I work at the American Sunlight Project, mentioned in all sorts of conspiracy theories that have gone viral, alleging that we're part of some, censorship industrial complex. This is the terminology that a lot of actors are using now to describe just basic media literacy work, basic digital governance work. And we've also seen members of Congress tweet about things like Transcarpathia. I don't know why any US member of Congress would tweet about this if they hadn't been, given talking points from somewhere else in Moscow. Right, so we've seen this happen in the last 2 weeks, even though, again, it's been percolating. And so the outlook and the trends in the interim in the States aren't particularly bright. We've seen funding slashed, we've seen researchers lose their jobs. So we're in a bit of a troublesome spot right now in terms of the US. But there has been a wealth of civil society collaboration in various researcher networks, for instance, the Coalition for Independent Technology Research. This is one. There's, of course, folks on this side of the pond, Edmo and others, doing great work to bring people together. But in the US, we've become hyper-polarized, and this isn't going to get better soon, and it's having impacts. We live in kind of, I hate to say it, but we live in kind of different realities. You could take any two Americans, off the street and ask them, basic questions, what's your perception on foreign aid? What percent do you think it is of the budget? And someone will say, oh, it's 50% of our budget. Someone will say, oh, it's like 10%. In reality, it's like 1%. But, people are just on completely different sides of just basic facts. And also platforms. Platforms have completely rolled back their content moderation and fact-checking and stuff in the States. Don't need to go into this. We've all seen the headlines. But really, we're entering a new kind of environment and tying things into international security and whatnot. We've seen elected officials across the U.S., frankly, on both sides of the aisle, the extremes on the rights and the extremes on the left, now state that, hey, NATO aid and any kind of security assistance from the US to Europe should be contingent on not enforcing the DSA, should be contingent on allowing platforms to kind of do whatever they want. And that flies in the US because we don't have these types of regulations. We have different standards of free speech in the law. And yet the US is now trying to, trying to sort of bend Europe's approach. How that plays out, I don't know. But it's particularly troublesome, I think, in terms of fostering international collaboration and cooperation in the face of hybrid threats from, Russia, China, Iran, and other actors. I'm trying my best to not be political, but unfortunately, disinformation itself has become kind of a political, dirty word. There's been science grants that have been pulled back in the last weeks. Nonpartisan work, really just basic work into societal impacts of all sorts of issues, public health, tech, AI, whatever. Anything that merely mentions the word disinformation or mentions the word woman or mentions the word bias, as in confirmation bias even. Grants that just mention these things are being pulled back now. So we're in a weird place because the collaboration is kind of being institutionally attacked, just in all aspects of scientific research. And so it's kind of becoming a bit more ragtag, if you will. And so I think, though, in terms of flipping back to the sort of more positive side, maybe some interesting notes for the future in terms of new technologies and whatnot, we are seeing sort of off the books, I would say, resistance to attacks on science and attacks on research. New platforms such as Blue Sky are emerging that I think are promoting a more healthy version of social media, in my own opinion. It's only my own opinion. And I think that, if European institutions and European researchers, kind of keep note of these threats that US researchers are facing, maybe invite them for a research stay in Europe, this is kind of one way that, we can continue to, research in this space, continue to, find new applications for AI that are positive, and so forth. So I'll cut myself there. Yeah.
Do you see artificial intelligence as a threat or as a tool to leverage in the combat against disinformation?
That's a good one. That's a good one. I think it's both. I mean, in terms of, say, deepfakes, my organization in particular has done some interesting research on the use of deepfakes in malicious contexts. Lately, we did a study. We found that 1 in 6 women in the US Congress have been depicted in deepfake pornography, so like non-consensual deepfakes made of them using their likeness. And so like that obviously is a clear threat. And that's becoming more and more and more of a problem. And, to date, completely unregulated in the US. But there's also been, on the flip side, new algorithms that are being developed and, kind of really deep techie stuff that I'm not an expert in, that, are being used to detect deepfakes. I think, right now the sort of threat side is winning, but, hopefully as more and more of this technology becomes open source, folks can use it for good.
Thank you, Benjamin. So I will give the floor to the Katerina, and I would like to ask her about how effective the Western democracy have been in recent years in countering disinformation. What strategies have worked, and where are the gaps in this way?
Well, I think that after the presidential elections in the United States in 2026, we really saw the impact of disinformation in swaying public perceptions in one of the, it's not the biggest democracy, but in one of the very important democratic actor. And the approach of the European Union was that there was a notion that social media platforms need to be regulated. It started with the, with the Code of Practice on Disinformation that at the beginning was voluntary, but then the pandemic really quickly showcased that the voluntary measures are never going to push any social media platforms that are earning a lot of money from sponsored content, from monetization of this information to actually take any kind of serious measures. So the Commission came up with the Digital Services Act and the need to really regulate social media platforms. While certain parts of the Digital Services Act have been in force already since August 2023, it's still a process that needs a lot of structures being developed, including the changes of legislations in respective EU countries, establishment of national coordinators, creating the board. So it is a process, and we see that, it's a huge step, but for me as a researcher and a person who's been dealing in this field, it's a bit slow, and a lot of times you see a lot of things, like sometimes the legislation is just too slow to conduct, that is always catching up on the realities, the threats that are happening. We'll see how the European Union is going to withstand, current decision of the Trump administration, because there have been several open letters from the Senate to new Commissioner Virkkunen. There have been announcements from social media platforms that they want to withhold third-party fact-checking. There's going to be a whole panel, and Tommaso and Carlos will definitely speak more about that, but it is a process, and the European Union is all about process and establishing the legislation, so it's very hard to say what will come out of it, because we're at this very interesting times for the EU representative to decide of how they want to proceed with the things. But I think that the EU so far has been very unique, that it has been pushing legislation, unprecedented legislation of social media platforms, and then eventually penalizing social media platforms that are not adhering to these legislative measures. So we'll see how successful it is going to be.
And what vulnerabilities the foreign actors exploit in order to spread disinformation in the Western countries?
Well, the first thing that you can see, and this is something that we pointed out and had a lot of discussions prior to the election to the European Parliament, is that, for example, the national politicians or politicians as such were not being fact-checked, which still enabled a lot of disinformation to be spread by political actors, which we already spoke about. And this also concerned, for example, having such false narratives being spread by sponsored content. And when we had these discussions, the reply of social media platforms was very easy, that they're not fact-checking the politicians because it's their right for the freedom of speech. Yes, but at the same time, if you have far-right extremists spreading videos where allegedly European Union is forcing its citizens to eat insects, and information that has been debunked for years in the whole Europe, then it's a bit ridiculous. So I think that we ourselves need to have much more talk about how we're going to protect our information landscape. The vulnerabilities that were observed are very easy. Sometimes our own legislation is not up to date. Sometimes, the electoral law doesn't actually talk about or include social media platforms that has become an important venue of electoral campaigning. There's very oversight how much money is being spent in these respective platforms. We need to have discussion what kind of content should be sponsored. We need to have discussions on what kind of measures should be taken during the silent period before the elections, we need to have discussions on the access to data from social media platforms, because as Ben said, this is one of the lessons learned, that a lot of researchers didn't have appropriate data to have a good situational awareness and understanding of what's happening on the ground before, for example, elections in Romania. We need to protect strong, independent institutions. before them becoming state captured and became, tools of political propaganda or political control. And we need to make sure that the national coordinators of Digital Services Act, which are now being established, actually understand the problematics of disinformation. In many cases, this is not the case. We need to establish, some of it has been established already within FIMI Act, the Open CTI, but a lot of it, it's focusing on civil society organizations, which are sometimes more flexible and more effective in adopting new challenges, while the public administration are still a bit slow, and it takes time for those kind of structures to be established. While they're happening, I think it's important that these structures include and provide ability for civil society organizations and researchers to be well patched in, despite of the fact that these researchers might not have complete clearance. A lot of time the problematic with for civil society organization to work with institutions is that they do not have requested clearance. So yeah, there are lots of vulnerabilities. I think that we are quite well aware of them. I think that a lot of things of how to handle these vulnerabilities and how to fix these gaps is dependent on the political will. Some of it needs to come and needs to be driven by the European Union, but not only by the European Union, but also by the broader domestic coalition of countries, including countries like South Korea, Australia, because we cannot build and protect democratic principles only within the European Union. But some of that political will needs to be actually driven and supported by domestic actors.
Thank you, Katerina. Ben, the same question: how effective were the institutions in UK in combating disinformation?
So,
when I say institution, I mean also the NGO sector, media, academia, etc. How effective was that war against the disinformation in UK?
Well, it depends which institution you're looking at. I mean, trust in politicians was polled at 11% last year, which was a great success because the previous year it was 9%. So, it really depends on which institution you look at. It's a mixed picture. In academia, for example, within the UK, there have long been, serious openings for autocratic regimes to finance actually important research in ways through their funds and affiliates in ways which really probably shouldn't have been permitted. But we did see a lot of very positive work over the lead up to the UK election. We saw, for example, the communications regulator Ofcom did some excellent work on sensitization. We saw the National Cybersecurity Centre supporting at-risk individuals at risk of hack and leak. So we saw some really positive work that was undertaken. And I'd also applaud, we had within the National Security Bill a foreign interference clause. Now, I think this was a sort of a path-breaking provision because it actually stipulates a maximum of 14 years in prison for hostile foreign actors seeking to subvert our democracy. So we need to think about incentives here, and anything that can be done to change that balance of incentives for those who try to manipulate our democratic process is a positive thing. I think when I look globally, some of the most powerful examples of when institutions have come together in order to effectively push back against some of these challenges have been when there's been a vision for that coalition building. If you have a look at Doublethink Lab's report on the Taiwan model, for example, one of the things that they looked at was about how there was a sense of shared purpose, and that really underpinned the collective strategic discipline of a whole range of societal actors heading into that election, which opened up the possibility in January last year of more effective pushback. So there's lots that can be learned, but in order to extract those lessons, we need to really, I think, sit down long before election time and not just wake up 2 months before the election and think, okay, you know, what do we do now? This is about preparedness, it's about early action, and it's about coalition building.
Do you have a strategy in state level or coordinative body that coordinate all these actions between institutions, NGO, media, academia, and other stakeholders when it comes to the combating disinformation?
So there's a messaging challenge, isn't there, at state level? Because, you know, I think, you know, democratic states want to very often be involved in trying to secure information integrity and to promote a healthy information environment, but don't want to be accused, understandably, of politicization. Because one of the narratives that hostile actors will often promote is that actually well-meaning civil society organizations, like American Sunlight Project and other great NGOs who are doing great work, will be accused of serving particular political interests. And so I think there's a messaging challenge there that we've not always, I think, you know, as a wider field, succeeded on. This challenge that we face now is not just about hostile actors trying to manipulate the information. It's also about the fact that we have lost the argument with a portion of middle ground voters, I think, that fact-checking or that information integrity, you know, that it does matter, and that it's not just about a politicized censorship, you know, agenda or whatever they want to delegitimate it as, but it's about freedom. It's about securing the freedom to think and the freedom for genuine elections. And so I think we need to look at our own messaging and think carefully about not just how do we strategically communicate to counter manipulative narratives, but how do we communicate to policymakers and those who might be at a base level convinced by some of these narratives, but who actually, you know, are not believing in that stuff out of some sort of manipulative agenda, but simply because we haven't made the argument powerfully enough.
Thank you, Ben. Before moving to Benjamin, I would like to prepare if you have some questions, because we are moving on Q&A session. We have 5 minutes for your question. So, Benjamin, the same question. How was effective the combat against the disinformation in US? And I will add also, what do you expect from the new administration in this regard? Is going to continue with the same manner, or will be a shift in the US approach?
Yeah, you know, at the moment, I think just on the level of just us as a whole country, we're not doing much. We're not doing much. We haven't done much, and we're not doing much. Certainly from a government level, there's been several efforts to stand up, you know, government bodies, government agencies to combat foreign influence, and these have kind of all fallen flat on their face due to whatever delegitimization tactics have kind of been thrown at them. And so we really, you know, obviously lack something like the DSA, which, just a follow-up, actually, one positive note in terms of the DSA, just last week in the Berlin Regional Court, a nonprofit, Democracy Reporting International, successfully sued X for data access under the DSA. TikTok, Meta had given access, but X did not, and they achieved a successful ruling, which I think is the first actual implementation of the DSA in that form, which is a great first step. But yeah, in terms of the US, we just don't have this. You know, in the US right now, if I wanted to go to, you know, the TikTok API or the Meta API, I either they'll tell me I don't have access based on my country, or you have to have like a .edu educational email to get access, which, you know, I don't because I'm not a student. So anyways, that's a challenge. So yeah, in terms of that, all of our efforts in the States are civil society based. There's no equivalent to the EU or the DSA, any of that. And so that creates, you know, a significant challenge, especially when, you know, domestic amplification of disinformation and false narratives, you know, whatever you want to call it. This is kind of at an all-time high, where people are really looking for, you know, their kind of own, you know, source of truth in that sense. You know, they're kind of clinging on to whatever conspiracies are going around, et cetera. And I think in terms of, Ben, what you said, winning the argument, this is key. One theme for us at the American Sunlight Project this year is meeting people where they are. That's kind of just our little motto internally. And what we mean by that is instead of just kind of publishing our policy briefs that go to the techie, nerdy crowd or whatever, it's about conducting outreach, conducting a media literacy training for maybe an unconventional audience of kind of quote unquote normal online people, and kind of throwing the politics out and just focusing on like, hey, here's how you can protect yourself online. Don't just share something without checking the URL, because if you share something false, your reputation might, take a hit. Kind of reframing things like that. So yeah.
Thank you very much, Benjamin. So we have a time, I think, for one or two questions. If our panelists will be short in their answers. So if someone have a question, yes, please just present yourself and tell for who is the question.
Yeah, thank you very much for this very interesting panel. I'm Olena Chiranova, I'm from Ukraine, Stop Fake. I'm not optimist, not pessimist still, but realist. I want just to ask, how do you think, considering what is happening in Slovakia, in the US, does Russia win this information war or not? And this question is for each participant. Thank you.
Katrina, please only just be short to have maybe for time for one more question.
It depends. Of course, I mean, a lot of state help for the Ukraine has been officially seized, but there's a huge movement within civil society organizations and NGOs, coordination, ordinary people donating so many things to Ukrainians that it's still very inspirational and helpful. And it's, it's in complete contrast of what is being done by our political leadership. So it showcased that, we're not completely lost. And it showcased that even ordinary people can make a huge difference. For example, there's a fantastic movement. It started in Slovakia. It started actually in Czech Republic, but also snowboarding in Slovakia. It's called A Gift for Putin. And they're fundraising from, medical kits to tomahawks. So, and they deliver everything. And I think it's a fantastic showcase of how civil society organizations and societies such can mobilize.
Thank you. Ben?
So it seems that, certainly at a global level, there are so many other actors who are now looking at the tactics that Russia has used over the years and realizing, actually, we can use these to our advantage as well. And that globalization of the Kremlin playbook, I think, is an extraordinary challenge because it poses the threat of such even much larger volumes of resources being put into those types of efforts. But I'd say that when we look at we look at Ukraine, we look at Taiwan, we look at the front lines of this information manipulation, we also see so much innovation and so much that the rest of the world can learn from, precisely because I think these societies have had to invest so much into that resilience. So, of course, it's very difficult to say that the information integrity field is on the path to winning. But if we want to get on that path, I think looking at some of those efforts in more detail, looking at some of that strategic communications, looking at how we can make democracy sexy again, or try to win the argument in more effective ways, in ways in which I think we see some of that in those geographies, would be a good idea.
Thank you, Ben. Benjamin?
Sadly, I think Russia currently is ahead in the States. Just again, or maybe this was this week, like a few days ago, a member of the presidential family, won't say which one, retweeted, quote tweeted, a Pravda video from Doppelganger, and linked, I believe, not fully sure, but linked to whatever website it was on, which was probably part of the Portal Combat Network, and that went massively viral. I mean, just insanely stupid viral. So that when, this happens, I can't think of any other answer than Russia is winning. How we fix it, I don't know.
Thank you very much. Thank you, Benjamin, Ben, Katerina. We had, I think, a wonderful discussion. We explored and analyzed the topics that matters for the public opinions today. Also, the audience, I think, that was happy, satisfied with your answer. But unfortunately, I have to stop this panel and to leave the space for the next one, which is EU and Baltic disinformation, if I'm not wrong. Yeah. Thank you very much. Thank you.
Now we move to session 2, EU and Baltic disinformation. Disinformation in Europe and the Baltic region has been growing, shaping public opinion and even policy decision. In this panel, we look at the main trends and how different countries are responding. I'm excited to welcome our speakers, Tapio Posalo, the European Center of Excellence, Finland, Hanna Liobakova from Belarus, and Gunta Sloga from Latvia. This session will be moderated by Joanna Lahana, the head of the communication and spokesperson for the European Union office in Kosovo. Mrs. Lahana, the stage is yours.
So welcome from me as well. I want first of all to thank the GeoPost for pulling this conference, for managing to organize this conference at this very important time and very complex geopolitical situation, because you're really fighting for information integrity, and we very much appreciate this. Indeed, we have come to a point where people who fight disinformation have become a target of disinformation themselves, where we have narratives blurring the lines between regulating illegal content and freedom of expression, the right to freedom of expression. I heard by Katerina before that the EU is unique. And personally, I take it as a compliment, working for the EU, being a spokesperson in Kosovo, because I do believe that we are unique. We are working very hard to protect our citizens while fully safeguarding the right to freedom of expression. And I am very proud as well that the EU is and will remain a reliable and predictable, most of all, partner, including for the Western Balkans. And while it's a cliché to quote somebody else, I will quote somebody else before beginning this panel. I will go quote Peter Pomerantsev, who said, "When information is a weapon, everyone is at war." And we see how much info is weaponized these days. With this in mind, let me start by introducing our speakers. We have Tapio here. He's the head of international relations at the European Center of Excellence for Countering Hybrid Threats, based in Finland. He's a career diplomat, currently on leave from the Finnish Foreign Service, extensive experience in security policy and multilateral diplomacy. He has served in various foreign and domestic postings, most recently as a political counsel in New York, where he worked on UN Security Council affairs. We also have with us Hanna Liobakova, an award-winning journalist and political analyst from Belarus, non-resident fellow at the Atlantic Council. She has covered developments in Belarus for various international media outlets. She has received the Freedom of the Media Award from the Transatlantic Leadership Network, the One Young World Journalist of the Year Award, and she was the finalist for the European Press Prize. She is currently working on a book about Belarus. And our last speaker who will join online is Gunta Sloga, another award-winning Latvian journalist, here's Gunta, editor and executive director of the Baltic Center for Media Excellence, one of the leading organizations in the region focused on media development and disinformation resilience. Through her work, she has supported new media initiatives, professional dialogue, freedom of speech, and societal resilience, integrating these themes into media development courses, networking activities, and public events. With this introduction, so that you know who we have here on board today with us, I would like us to begin the discussion focusing on the negative parts first. All right, we will start with the negative, the dangers, and the narratives. And I will start with Tapio first. Can you give us an outline of the disinformation trends in Europe with a focus on the Baltics?
Thank you so much, Joanna, and thank you to Gunnen and Geopost for organizing this event. It's a great pleasure being here. I come from the Harbor COE in Helsinki, and since we are an international organization focused on countering harbor threats in the whole Euro-Atlantic region, let me begin with some region-wide observations. So first of all, looking at the sort of overall trends, we argue that the overall intensity and assertiveness of hybrid threats has really increased in the past year, with, of course, Russia and People's Republic of China challenging Europe the most. The overall objectives for them seem to be to undermine our partnerships, including by, for example, dividing the EU and NATO from within, impeding EU and NATO expansion, of course, especially in the Western Balkans, as I'm sure you well know, undermine our democratic institutions, including credibility of elections, eroding public trust in our societies, also dividing our populations, polarizing them to challenge the internal stability of our societies, cause disruptions in our societies to spread insecurity and fear, eroding public trust again, and finally, of course, also weakening our support to Ukraine. I guess these all really apply to disinformation as well, although sort of broader trends. And on disinformation, we see that both Russia and China have really escalated their information operations against Europe and the US recently. Russia investing heavily into disinformation. Some experts estimate that it's in the magnitude of $4 to $6 billion per year. And we're certainly not responding to that challenge with resources. Also, I noticed that the recent World Economic Forum Global Risk Perception survey put disinformation and misinformation as the most severe risk in the next 2 years' time frame. I think this is something we really have to focus on. And some experts, referenced also by Europol, have estimated that by 2026, as much as 90% of online content might be generated by artificial intelligence. And this really illustrates the huge magnitude of the threat from disinformation. And we've really seen the worst ramifications in some of the recent elections. But then looking at some of the recent trends in Europe, I would argue that disinformation seems to be using a lot more assertive tactics and tools. Russia and China cooperating much closer than before. Also using AI more actively for content creation, for deepfakes, for scaling their operations with analysis capabilities, for managing bot networks and fake accounts. There was a recent leak from the social, what is it called again? The Russian agency that said that there were about 34 million social media comments in the first 4 months of 2024 in the run-up to the European election, and that also really illustrates the sort of quantity of the volume of this threat. But I also wanted to go a little bit into the Baltics, considering that the Baltics is certainly one of the key targets for Russia due to its, of course, geographical location, historical and demographic connections to Russia, the remaining Russian minorities in the region. And for this reason, I think it's susceptible to Russian disinformation. And one specific in that disinformation has been sort of historical fabrication, including, for example, questioning the borders in the Baltics based on historical borders of Russia, as they say. We've seen sort of a shift of Russian disinformation into social media after a lot of Baltic countries closed access to Russian media outlets. Russia seems to be especially using far-right alternative media ecosystems for spreading its disinformation. And as was also mentioned, it's also prominent in the Baltics that Russia is using smear campaigns against politicians, also bribery of politicians, trying to sort of have an impact on the political discourse. For example, in the run-up to the Finnish and Swedish NATO accession, Russia was trying to increase tensions with Turkey to delay that NATO accession. And for example, in Poland, Russia seems to be driving anti-Ukraine sentiment, including, for example, by amplifying the farmers' protest quite recently. And most recently, there's been a lot of disinformation connected to the decoupling of the electric grid in the Baltics from Russia, and a very, very active campaign at that, trying to sort of convince the population that there's a risk of blackouts or electricity is getting more expensive or something like that. Although Russia hasn't been selling electricity to the Baltics in the past 2 years, and there really hasn't been any issues. But I think that's my sort of first comments, but I'm sure colleagues will have a lot to add. Thanks.
Thank you very much. Indeed, many comments, many topics opened. So I want us to go a bit more deep in the narratives themselves, Gunta. Which are the primary disinformation narratives targeting the Baltic states, and have they evolved over the years?
Yes, good morning, everybody, and I'm really pleased to join at least online to this conference, because I think it's extremely important that we continue talking about all those issues in those very turbulent times. So greetings from very frosty Riga. Yes, I think Tapio already gave this bigger framework on where we are when we talk about disinformation. But when we go deeper to narratives, I should say at the first that, of course, the Balts, and I mean Estonians, Latvians, and Lithuanians, for many years we were proud that we are very capable to fight Russian misinformation or disinformation. Because actually it started on the very day when we regained independence more than 30 years ago. But unfortunately, of course, the last years with different kinds of developments of digital spread of disinformation, AI, deepfakes, and so on, has made also our societies more vulnerable when it comes to disinformation and disinformation resilience. But when we go to narratives, then I would say that, of course, the biggest one Russia tries to spread, and sometimes it becomes quite successful one, is failed state narrative. At first, that we are economically weak, we cannot be independent, and that is why also always this integration in EU, cooperation with USA is interpreted also as a sign of our weakness, not that a sign of our strength, being part of these groups of countries. And it's very easily to integrate those narratives in different kinds of messages of local politicians in both parts, like very pro-Kremlin parties, also very radical right nationalistic parties, because we see that societies all over Western world currently are not very satisfied with the situations they have. And it's very easy to say that like these are just very bad countries with bad governments and so on. Another topic Russia has been using for years is the fact that we are countries which are full of Russophobia, that we are discriminating our minority groups, and I could say that this is not something new, and we have been used to it. And another part of narratives, of course, is something we could call traditional values, which again is that like we, Baltic countries, are part of this rotting West, and like all we are like supporting all those LGBT plus issues, gender, and so on. And again, these narratives are very easily spread also by some local actors. And I should say that it's not always intentional, that like, okay, we are now spreading Russian disinformation. It's just taking those narratives and then adjusting for your own use. But when disinformation experts analyze this language or narratives themselves, you can see that it's like one-to-one what Russian propaganda is spreading. And of course, also Tapio mentions this support for Ukraine. Again, this is something we see specifically lately. We see also it in surveys at the beginning of the war. Huge parts of population were supporting Ukraine in different kinds of ways, also with money, with different kinds of other resources, donating clothes, food, and so on and so on. And we can see that this is decreasing. From one side, you could say that everybody is just war fatigue, but also you can hear those narratives that like, how much we can help Ukraine. Ukraine is corrupt. Everything is corrupted there. This money is misused. And another part of this narrative is that like we need this money more than others. And then, of course, sometimes these are more like targeted campaigns against some politicians, like again trying to show them as the ones who are not competent or not professional. There was this funny, I could say funny message when a new Prime Minister of Latvia was appointed, that she is a female. And so there was this blurry video made which portrayed that when she was young girl, she was part of some porno film business. And of course it was total fake. And government Stratcom got involved, and quite easily they stopped it. But still, you could see that people in some social media are arguing, yes, but this very blurry video, this girl looks quite similar to Prime Minister. And you just see that it's also sometimes, as Taipa already said, sowing different kinds of doubts, sowing, this mistrust, trying to divide. And it's not only about narratives, but really creating those different kinds of emotions which are dividing people. And of course, it's specifically easily to be done because we have those Russian minorities, specifically in Estonia and Latvia, and all the surveys show that also when it comes to the support of the war, there is a part of those minorities who are pro-Kremlin, and it's quite clear that they are under this Russian propaganda. And although we have blocked all those big TV channels which were broadcasting propaganda, we can see that it's not working in that sense, that there is still Telegram, there is YouTube, and if you just look for another resources, you will get all this propaganda. So actually, this is a huge issue. How do we deal with this group of people who are like heavily addicted? It's a very small part, of course, but still, it's a big issue. So I think I will stop there, and we can go further later.
Thank you, Gunta. A long list of narratives targeting the Baltic states, but what about Belarus, Hanna? What are the main narratives coming from Russia there? What are the dangers?
Thank you so much. I'll probably add to my official bio that I don't live in Belarus, I live in exile. I'm a Belarusian citizen, but I had to leave my country back in 2020. Last year, I was sentenced to 10 years in absentia by a court in Minsk, and I was labeled a terrorist and extremist. So that's also part, I think, first of the bio, but also of the narratives. Well, Belarus perhaps is an extreme example of what can happen if you allow Russia to be present in your country. As you probably know, state media Belarus has never been a democratic state, and state media is controlled in Belarus. We used to have independent media in the country. Now they had to flee, especially after protests in 2020, which some of you might remember. That was the biggest revolution, uprising in the country, unprecedented, and hundreds of thousands of people were protesting. Lukashenko felt really, really scared, really threatened. He's the dictator that has been in power for 30 years, more than 30 years. And he has always been Russian ally, Putin's ally, but especially after this protest, he turned completely to and for Russia's, expecting Russia's support. And as a result, the presence of Russian narratives became widespread, became overwhelmed in the country. Belarusian state media that had some independence lost information sovereignty. So we assess it. We say that Belarus lost information sovereignty. First, because of the narratives in the first place, because of the presence of Russian colleagues from RT, Russia Today, in Belarus, who openly said that they advise their Belarusian colleagues on narratives, because of pro-Russian and anti-Ukraine guests and experts that kind of were never on state TV before in Belarus, but they became frequent guests, and they are still. So that's basically how it looks. You not only have pro-Lukashenko propaganda, but you, of course, have now pro-Russian propaganda. What I think is dangerous is that it completely mirrors all the narratives that Russians are spreading in their own country. They exist in Belarus. With the attack against independent media, that became prevalent. What Russians are also doing, last year they announced the creation of a joint media holding of Belarus and Russia, investing 10 million euros into that. Support for independent media from the EU is much smaller, so you see where kind of the bar that they are rising themselves. They are becoming more present on TikTok. TikTok is important in Belarus. Of course, we understand the threats, but that's the fastest growing platform in the country. It's not banned. Neither YouTube nor Instagram have been banned in Belarus so far. We had internet shutdowns, but these platforms exist. So in the past years, we've seen the growing sort of presence of kind of pro-Lukashenko narratives there as well. They are not really, they're cringe. They're not really great, they're not really creative because, these people luckily are not creative, but I think they are learning also from the Russians. And what the regime is also doing, they put a lot of attention to this. They are saying that TikTok is our nuclear weapons, and they are also controlling influencers who are in Belarus, even food bloggers. So instead of kind of creating their own narratives, they push their narrative through these people who have support from or kind of popularity among the youth, among youngsters. On the more positive note, I'm sure we will also focus on this. Despite the fact that we have left the country, we have enormous outreach. On TikTok, we cover around 90% of our content is being watched and read from inside the country. On YouTube as well, so we have huge numbers. YouTube became alternative television, so people just go on YouTube to watch because many of them don't trust state television. And one of the, I think, best examples of this trust and this kind of outreach that we have is that those people who have access to independent media in Belarus, they of course don't support the full-scale invasion of Ukraine. They don't support attacks from the territory of Belarus, of Ukraine, and they don't support the presence of Russian nukes, the deployment of Russian nukes rather, in Belarus. So I think that's the kind of outcome and result of our work, of independent journalists' work, and also that, not always Russian propaganda is very effective.
And a follow-up question about the narratives starting from Moscow or Minsk towards the Baltic states or the EU in general. Do you think that, which are the narratives, and do you think they actually take hold? People believe in them and it erodes their trust towards the EU?
Well, Gunther already mentioned some of them, but of course the Baltic states have been presented in Belarus as weak, controlled by the US, by NATO. They are Russophobic, which probably is a compliment in a way, but of course they're like puppets and everything. What I think is in a way dangerous is that they are being presented as sort of the stage ground for potential attacks on Belarus or, of course, on Russia, which is not true. I don't think that Belarus should expect any potential, any threats from these countries, but that's how they're being presented. Does it work? Again, for those people who consume information, but we are talking about maximum 30% of the population. Given all the bans, given all the censorship, people just don't, go and watch TV or read the state-controlled newspapers, which I think is a great sign. I think in the long term, this is dangerous because, again, if you are fed all the time with this information, that would be like in Russia because, that they, at least larger share of their population believe in these narratives. Then, of course, I'm based in Vilnius, so Vilnius is, according to propaganda, is the home for terrorist groups, camps. We have been trained there to attack Ukraine, or to attack Belarus. So this is kind of the narratives that they're using. Regarding the EU is decaying, the EU is morally corrupt. Gunther mentioned this sort of, LGBT or kind of, the narrative there that they use. They are also saying that this is to attack our Belarusian and Russian culture. So I think what probably is interesting is also some research that has been done. It's not public, but it has been done by some American organizations showing that Belarusians are still looking at the EU, at Scandinavian states, at Switzerland as the examples of the level of life, of how it should be, of, scientific research, kind of education level and so on, while they feel very much connected mentally to Russia. But I think, again, these kind of good examples that the EU can boast of is something that we probably should develop more. And, if I may, last point, I think what is also interesting is how now, I'm going a bit deeper, but Belarusians see that, because of sanctions, because of this pressure that has been imposed on the regime in Belarus for various international crimes, people also feel the consequences, and they feel that the EU is turning its back on them, while they also see that Russia is kind of a supporter here because they can travel to Russia, they can study there, they can work there, and that's again something that the EU can change in its own sort of messaging regarding Belarus. Not only Lukashenko, of course, should be punished and should be mentioned in a negative light, but there might be probably some other messaging saying that, well, we support Belarus, we support Belarusians' aspirations for democracy, and kind of some more positive messaging so people don't feel left out.
I took a very good note of this. Although I'm communicating for Kosovo, I will make sure that this message goes to our HQ. And I would like to circle back to Tapio. You mentioned the cables, the unplugging. There is an unplugging of Estonia, Latvia, and Lithuania from the grid, but we had some sabotages in December. I want to ask you, how do disinformation campaigns intersect with cyber threats? You did mention narratives like blackouts, like dependence on electricity, but I'd like you to tell us a bit more on that.
Well, thank you. That's actually a very pertinent question. I think it's been debated hotly lately, and indeed quite a topical issue, especially in the Baltic region with the recent cable cuts. Mostly not with cyber though. It's mostly been sort of physical sabotage, but we've also seen those sort of cyber sabotage, for example, against water facilities across Europe and also in the US. So I think we've seen a lot of both. But especially in relation to these cable cuts, I think we've seen a lot of disinformation campaigns related to them, and not only in the past few months, but in during several years. And I think the first really sort of pertinent example was the Nord Stream sabotage in 22, because after that sabotage, we saw some very strong disinformation campaigns and confusing narratives on, for example, involvement of Norway and the US in this sabotage, and then of course the Ukraine narrative, Ukrainian divers from a sailing boat sabotaging the Nord Stream. And I think even after all these years, there's still just confusion. There's no sort of result to the investigations. There's no evidence. There's nothing very concrete about that, and that really illustrates how disinformation typically is connected to other events. And this is actually what we also because we're not only looking at disinformation, we're mostly looking at all different kinds of hybrid threats. And basically, what makes them hybrid is the combination of different kinds of means. Mm-hmm. In this case, I'd say disinformation is the typical sort of follow-up to, for example, physical sabotage, and really sort of using that event to cause confusion in the society, to create distrust in the society against the government, and really just to sow sort of, fear and confusion.
Thank you, and now we'll go to Gunta again to ask her if foreign actors are actually using these narratives to fuel panic and distrust towards the EU.
I think this example of those cables, it is a very good example. It's just like we still don't have this very strict conclusion, like who is doing it. Of course, we have different kinds of suggestions. Like last week, I was in the briefing of with high-level defense officials, and they said, okay, it's quite clear. We have now registered 12 cases of sabotage against some kind of cables in the Baltic Sea in last 15 months. It cannot be coincidence. It cannot be accident. But then again, when somebody asks, could you do something to protect those cables? But it becomes impossible because there are kilometers and kilometers and kilometers of many cables in the Baltic Sea bed, and you just cannot put some kind of guard ship on every cable. And it's just brilliant example, and we can see it with this. Switch to EU power grid just last weekend, all 3 Baltic countries. It was very huge event. All 3 Baltic countries switched from Russia's power grid to EU power grid. It was multi-year project, millions of euros invested, and it is again one of those signs that we are moving further away from Russia. But how it was used, that actually this is stupid, that boats are disconnecting because you see what's happening with cables in the Baltic Sea. This electricity will also be cut. But the thing is that electricity cables are not going through the sea, at least those which have been affected. These have been communication cables. But you see this creating some kind of nervousness. People start asking questions like, oh, is it that? Is it true? And I think this is just this great example how make us nervous, or just those accidental drones which are flying in many countries. From one side, you could say, yes, these are Russian military drones which have accidentally changed their trajectories. But then again, we recently saw it in Latvia. It just made huge headlines because, again, this is involving all those questions. Are we safe? Are we ready enough to work with those, protecting our airspace? and sometimes it's not about like very some kind of targeted disinformation campaign. It's more about those some kind of underneath campaigns, I could call them in that way, that they just make population nervous or just doubting and asking questions to government about issues which are very clear.
Thank you. And you did mention, Tapio, that there was some confusion. We regard the Baltic states at the forefront of fighting Russian disinformation. My own ambassador comes from Estonia. We have had several discussions about how his country and our EU member state managed successfully to show resilience against this disinformation. I want to ask you, can you share some good practices, even better, some best practices, I would say, that we could use?
Well, thank you. I'll definitely be happy to try my best, and I may be a little bit biased coming from Finland, but then again, I do think the Baltics have a lot of good practices that we can share. And actually, I'd say very much like the Balkans, the Baltics also have sort of good societal resilience against hybrid threats and disinformation, especially. Disinformation doesn't seem to be having much of an impact on the Baltics. I think maybe a few topics to highlight is sort of this historical awareness of the threat, of the Russian threat in general, which sort of creates an immunity against disinformation. I think there's also strong political consensus. Ben mentioned that the trust in the UK government was something like 11%. For example, in Finland, I think it's up to 47 or so. In the Baltics, pretty much the same. So the trust in the government is actually quite high, which makes sort of strategic communications much more effective. There's good education, many of the Baltics being at the top of the PISA surveys, for example, and having a long history of media literacy education, decades actually already. There's a strong NATO support in many of the countries, so there's no disagreement on support to NATO. And for example, this sort of recent disentanglement from Russian energy supply, from the electric grid, from economic dependencies, for example, also supports this sort of resilience. And maybe I should just mention also the media freedom, the sort of free and independent media with sort of self-regulation bodies, making sure that they don't fall victim to these disinformation narratives. But maybe that's the main highlights I'd like to mention.
And what about you, Gunta? Can you share some best practices that we, either in the EU or the Balkans, can use?
It's hard to add to what Tapi already said, because I could agree on everything he said. What I have noticed recently when we talk about different kinds of media literacy campaigns or disinformation campaigns, what actually works the best way is something very, I could say, very old way of having it is really going and talking and discussing with people. And we just recently finished a huge project in all three Baltic countries, but mostly focused in Estonia and Lithuania, where we have those Russian minority groups, and it's hard to reach out to them because they are quite isolated, living in the eastern parts of each country. And we just went there and created with something in cooperation with local communities called media clubs, where people could come and discuss different kinds of issues. And we didn't come with this big slogan, we will discuss Russian propaganda. It was much softer way on how do you actually value your local post-Soviet architecture in your town and so on. So, and I could see that actually this is maybe it's hard to do it on large scale, but really going back to this very, very old way of having dialogue, specifically in local small communities where people live together. And of course, also if I could stress once more as Tapio already told the role of the media, and it's true. If you look at the Media Freedom Index made by Reporters Without Borders annually, all the countries of this region, Nordic countries and Baltic region, is in this top 20. Nordics are like this very top of the top. So, and you can see this correlates, of course, and yes, of course, also media information literacy, also integrated in school systems, also is something important. But then again, it's for us as educators and practitioners, it's very important to understand that this is something we have to adjust, because all the new technologies like AI, deepfake, it's, you know, like you have to work with those audiences with the latest examples. So how do you actually understand how information is made, how algorithms work, and so on. So it's actually a huge challenge for us, not only to understand what to do, but find the right tools for right audiences.
Exactly, this is a challenge that we would all have to face and use it to fight for the good, I would say, but we will come to that. I want to come to Hannah now. We heard about media freedom, we heard about trust in institutions, and I would add here, allow me to add the judiciary as well, which is very strong, the trust there compared to other countries. Hannah, what would it take to apply these strategies in Belarus?
Oh, well, I guess regain the state. No, I mean, to a certain extent, again, so I talked a little bit about successes, right, and this outreach that we have. It doesn't come from nowhere. It's not a miracle, right? That's the, you know, consistent work that independent journalists have been doing for decades. In a way, what happened in 2020, right, when many of us had to flee, I left the country in 2020. Then in 2021, most of the journalists left because of this kind of attack on civil society that now, in hindsight, we see it as the preparation for the invasion, by the way. We were prepared for this because for years, you know, Belarus has never been a democratic state apart from the first years of our independence. So we had our media already registered somewhere in the EU, in Poland, in Lithuania. And then when we had to relocate, we just kind of moved our operations there. So nobody, kind of no media outlet got to stop their operations. And I think that's also a huge success. Interestingly so, because of the frozen aid from the US, 1/3 of our outlets are saying that they might actually shut down, like end their operations, not because of the regime, I imagine, but because of this financial blow that they will face, they're facing already. Then it's our self-organization that's perhaps the best practice that I could also share here, something that we are really proud of. So we were able to, you know, continue operations, but also do more. Despite us being in exile, so you're basically disconnected from your own country, imagine this. We are still able to conduct investigations, we are still able to get information from the ground. How are we doing this? Because of great colleagues. So we have cyber partisans, these are white hackers who basically got access to kind of different data inside the country and successfully leaked it to journalists. It's, of course, bad, GDPR and everything, but when you have a dictatorship, we have to, you know, close eyes to on some issues. And then, of course, we have former policemen who also resigned, who fled, but they also fled with a lot of data. That's also something that helps us do a lot today. There are people who travel, there are people who I'm still in touch with inside the country. We all have our sources. The regime labeled me a terrorist just to prevent this connection from the people inside the country, because they can go to jail if they communicate with me or share information. That's like supporting terrorism for the regime, but that's still happening. And of course, these people are really, really brave, you know, for doing this. And again, all these kind of tactics that we are using, you know, our journalists have been super, super creative in so many ways, right? You have the variety of outlets, you have the different ways how to reach audiences. And I think in a way, the regime is also helping here. So first of all, when the information is controlled, imagine something is happening like a huge storm and like hundreds of villages have been cut off from electricity, but propaganda wouldn't report on that because it's bad, right? It's like, it's criticizing the regime or something. There is no kind of, how to say, instructions sent, and they don't know what to do. People turn to independent media because that's the source of information. When Wagner troops relocated, moved to Belarus, that was also the same. We saw a huge influx of people who usually don't read us. They were curious, you know, because that's something kind of unexpected, something that is dangerous. Also, people saw the danger in this, saw the threat of coming. But it also comes to different, you know, like we talked about institutions and you asked about them, right? Courts, they are not serving people, right? I know it from my own experience. So of course people, you know, I don't know, contact human rights defenders who are in exile, right? They look for help there. So there is kind of this very interesting connection between those people who are inside and those people who are outside in exile. And of course the regime is trying to cut us, but we are still, you know, we still need each other, and that's why we cannot, of course, sort of exchange or be the alternative institution for the alternative state. We cannot create the alternative state, of course, for us in exile. But I think that there is still this, you know, collaboration. There is still this trust between us. It's stronger than the regime is trying to present.
Thank you, and I will pass in the last set of questions, bringing on the topic of AI, knowing that there is a separate panel dealing with AI, but I'm gonna make a nice introduction to the panel when this happens. So I'll start with Tapio, and about you already mentioned some Europol data, and that AI disinformation now, we have to talk about it. All right, how can we stay ahead of emerging threats?
What a big question, and I have to highlight that I'm also not a technical expert on AI, so my thoughts will be sort of more generic. But I know there are some really good examples on how to, for example, use AI in monitoring the media environment, in identifying emerging trends and narratives and so on. I think we definitely have to work on that. That would be one way to tackle the huge resource gap between Russian disinformation spending and our own sort of small resources to counter it. If we find new ways to innovatively use AI to monitor the media environment, then maybe also use AI to debunk some of the information, in some cases also pre-bunk if we can, that might actually make a bit of a difference. And I think there we are slightly ahead of Russia, probably not ahead of China, unfortunately. They're pretty good at AI. But I think we have to use that advantage and make sure that we remain technologically more advanced and use that to our benefit. And I guess the big question in the following years will be the combination of AI to quantum computing and how that will just accelerate everything. And on that note, I think we also have to be ahead of the technological development and make sure that we effectively use this combination also for countering disinformation. Thanks.
And Hanna, in Belarus, is there a use of AI-generated content or deep fakes to spread disinformation, to spread specific narratives?
Yeah, I mean, they're also learning, unfortunately, so what can we do about that? So they recently actually published interesting examples of our democratic forces leaders, Svetlana Tikhanovskaya or her advisor, like she was saying in this video that she's resigning, like she's like stepping over, and then she, like the other guy who's like the second, let's say there, who's like her deputy, is taken over. And then of course nobody believed in that because it was visible that it's not her, like, you know, her lips were moving differently, whatever, and it's just not possible that she would say this. But one of the politicians who is not, who is critical of the leader, he was like, yeah, finally, you know, that's a great decision, you know, great step to do. And he is also on the pro-democratic side. So they are not only, you know, the regime kind of is affecting, I think they're also using these vulnerabilities or conflicts, internal fights that exist in the democratic forces, right? Not to mention people who are sort of not interested in politics or not convinced or wouldn't know the context. So I think this is dangerous, so it is working. Regarding other things, generally they've been, as much as Belarus has been named, labeled, I think previously, before, like the IT hub of Europe, there were many countries who were named this way, but I think we kind of took the pride there because we had many IT specialists who actually, many of them left because of repression, but that was quite, you know, an important field. And that also, unfortunately, led to the fact that the regime has been quite advanced in how they use technology. So they, till today, they are identifying people who participated in protests. It's been almost 5 years. They're able still to do this because of the use of face recognition technology. In the first kind of phase, the first year, I guess, of after protest, they used the Sandvine technology, which is the American company. Then they stopped kind of sending whatever, sharing this technology, but now I think they're developing their own with the help of Russia and China as well. So that's something that we can also include Belarus in this, you know, global coalition of axis of, you know, bad actors, bad guys. And of course there are like other things that they're doing. They are very successful in following digital footprint of people, like people are being arrested for leaving comments. So that's the crime in Belarus. So yeah, they are successful. I mean, they are using, they have their effect here. Whether they can convince people, again, it's still a question. Belarusian propaganda, pro-Lukashenko propaganda is still at the level of like burning a $1 note and saying that, you know, we are against kind of dollars, whatever. And of course, we had to joke that why it's only $1 and not 100, like if you are so against that. So for now, we might be probably safer, but again, they are unfortunately learning.
Thank you. And because we focused on AI, but we didn't mention a lot legacy media, I don't know if you know, but Gunta has actually worked a lot with Latvia's public broadcaster. And I would like her to give us a few bullet points on how public broadcasters can increase the resilience against disinformation.
Yes, I think at first public service broadcasting is one of those media who don't need to fight for their everyday survival as it is for many commercial media across Europe. We know this very well. And this gives them free hands to really work on specific issues. And we also have been involved on different kinds of projects, starting, for example, from quiz shows for youngsters, which go through media literacy curricula, but it never says that it is media literacy quiz show. It just says it's a funny quiz show led by very popular influencers. So it's again how you pack it in. But then, of course, it's much more important issue of having very good investigative journalism teams who really investigate and go after local politicians, go after some global corruption and other cases. It's also a question of trying to actually explain what's happening, because this is very important that media, and specifically public service broadcasting, is doing something we call explanatory constructive journalism, because it's a very complex world we live in currently, and it's very hard to understand what's happening. I think we already mentioned this case with those cables in the Baltic Sea, and it's very important for media to be the ones who explain in very simple ways. We have to learn from those TikTok influencers. Those sometimes I'm thinking myself and discussing it with colleagues how much we can learn actually from bad actors, not with the content but with formats they do, because this is this huge issue. Also, I think media and any public body or government officials or NGOs who support media, for everybody it would be very important to explain why do we need legacy media and why they are still very important part of our democracies.
Thank you very much. Here in Kosovo, in a recent survey, we saw that legacy media practically are still #1. This is where people get their info from. And then comes social media. So indeed, legacy media remain the driving force of information. We have time for one question, maybe two, so I'd like to give the floor to you. Yes, please. Could you please introduce yourself and let us know to whom you address the question.
Hello to all, I'm Lorik Idrizi of Birds Institute, North Macedonia. I wanted to know the opinion of panelists about the initiative of Reporters Without Borders, that they are launching and promoting the platform Journalist Trust initiative, and is algorithmic a way to promote the qualitative journalism content. And do you think this is good for combating disinformation, or is too much forcing for achieving that?
Who would like to read the question? Hannah, do you want to? Yeah.
No pressure, right? Everybody's... look, in my opinion, whatever people are doing is great, right? So it's just kind of, to who would you promote it? Who are you targeting with? I think these are the questions, right? You cannot. For me as a journalist, right, you need to know your audience. If it's just an archive of some best examples of journalism, it might make a lot of sense, but there is a question whether it really reaches people, or is just kind of the, sort of number of materials that have been published on this web page. But yeah, only, why not? Why not? If it's just one of the initiatives that I think these guys are doing, this organization, which I think they've been doing a lot.
If I may try as well. If I may try to respond as well, why I was hesitating is because I wasn't aware of this initiative, but it does sound really interesting, and it actually corresponds with the challenge of AI. I mean, if we're facing, well, let's say 90%, if that's accurate, 90% of content online generated by AI, I think we need something like this, like a network of trusted media where you can always find independent information or sort of verified facts and so on. It does sound like it's definitely a step in the right direction. And I'm also thinking about the sort of journalist ethics networks, which are typically sort of, like homegrown, sort of established by the media themselves. And I think this also corresponds with what you have like nationally, these sort of journalistic ethics bodies, for example, and having something like that internationally to have a network of trusted journalists with strong ethics. I guess it really does sound like a good initiative, although I'm not aware of it in detail. Thanks.
Gunda, would you like to add something?
Yes, I am aware of this initiative, and I know that public service broadcasters across the Baltic countries have joined the Journalism Trust initiative. overall, I think it's a very good mechanism. For example, when you go through this process, you as your media, you already have to think about some issues to discuss. You know, your go deeper with your ethic codes and code of conduct and so on. The only maybe criticism would be that actually this initiative could be better promoted, because in our very tight media professional and experts world, we know about it, but actually this, you know, like this GTI index, it should be known by wider public that these are the media whom we really can trust, because they have gone this quite a long process of recognizing different kinds of things.
And with this, we're about to conclude. I want to ask our three speakers to imagine that you are the ones making the decisions. Which would be the one priority that you would have to counter the threats of the next 5 years? Hannah, 30 seconds you have.
Okay, well, thank you again.
20.
Thank you again for this. Three things, really briefly. So first of all, support for independent media. We are effective. We are reaching people inside the country. With the US cuts, it will be harder. There was recently the announcement of the EU that they're going to, they're committing more money for Belarusian and Russian independent media. But again, that might take time to get this financial support while our media needs it now. Second, really briefly, restrictive measures against channels and people who are involved in propaganda, and of course repression. My judge who sentenced me to 10 years has not been sanctioned by the EU, so he, in theory, could travel. And platforms, our sort of fight with, Google, YouTube regarding first the Belarusian language, which has been undermined there, I would say. It's difficult to promote content in Belarusian, and of course the whole kind of support, let's say, for state media instead of independent media, because it's easier for state media to be present on Google, because Google considers our websites blocked and it pessimizes it. So this is something that should be changed as well. Thank you.
Thank you. Quick. Great. Tapio.
Thank you. I wish, as a decision maker, I had all the resources I can get, because that's going to be one of my points. First of all, I'd put a lot more resources into monitoring and documenting the media environment to identify the threat. Then I'd put a lot more money and also sort of promote this whole of society coordination on raising awareness. I think that's one thing that Ukraine has done really efficiently, bringing together the civil society organizations, individuals, companies, businesses, to counter disinformation. I think that has been really effective. I'd also put in a bit more resources in repairing and preventing sort of weaknesses in the information system, like, for example, legislating through the DSA and self-regulation and so on. And then finally, again, I would also put a bit more resources and efforts into limiting, challenging, constraining, punishing the actors, deterring them by any means possible, limiting the information space from hostile actors and so on. But that's my 5 cents. Thanks.
Excellent. And Gunta, you're the last one. 30 seconds.
Yeah. Yes, I will try to be short. So nothing new, really, supporting media and other organizations who are on the forefront on disinformation resilience, and also supporting Ukraine, because Ukraine is fighting for all of Europe. We should remember this, and also thinking how we can, as Europe, really fight back those guys at big tech, because we see that there are many people with bad intentions.
Exactly, there are many people with bad intentions. There's also a panel about Ukraine. Ludmila is here to moderate. Thank you very much. Thank you, Tapio. Thank you, Hannah. Thank you, Gunta. And thanks to all of you for following this panel.
Fact-checking is one of the best ways to fight disinformation, but new challenges keep appearing. Experts from various countries will provide insights into the complexities of this issue. I'm pleased to hand over to our panel moderator, Gunan Venhari, and his distinguished panel members for an insightful discussion. Please take the stage, Gunan. Panelist is Tommaso Caneta, Italy, Jakub Schilz from Poland, and Carlos Hernandez from Spain.
Sorry, I need to come again on the floor. And I would like to thank Tommaso, especially because your support these days for us, it's very important. And thank you very much being here, and also Jakub, thank you so much. I meet you a couple of times in Europe conferences, but it's important to ask Kosovars to come and to visit Pristina finally. I would like, and also Carlos, I think is online. Carlos, do you hear us, maybe?
Yeah, I can hear you. Thanks for the invitation.
Needs to give us some sunny dates from Spain, so we need optimistic weather from you and news, of course. I don't know what's harder to get the sun or to get the optimism these days, but I think we'll get there. I will continue with this panel and with Tommaso. Tommaso is from European Fact-Checking Association and EDMO and Facta News, and I don't think maybe, yeah, of course. And Tommaso, which is the biggest challenges from the beginning of creating the fact-checking? I think 2025 will be something different.
Yeah, I think we are facing unprecedented challenges, and I think that the fact-checking community is under attack. We have been under attack, of course, also in the past from the East, of course, and from the domestic actors in every country that align with the propaganda points from Russia, especially from Russia. But now, even more dangerous, much more dangerously, we are under attack from the West. And the attack against fact-checking, it's consistent, it's a part of a larger attack against European democracies. Let me explain a little bit better. 2.5 generations of Europeans inform themselves almost exclusively on social media platforms. And these social media platforms, they are not neutral editors. They decide through algorithms the content that we see more and the content that we see less. So it's going to be Ukrainians are Nazis or Ukrainians are victims of Russian aggression. Climate change exists or it doesn't. The EU is the Soviet Union of the 21st century, or with all its defects and flaws, it's still, a power fighting for rule of law and democracy. And sadly, we see what's the trend. It's not exactly the one that we hope for. And this is not by accident, I think, and I fear. Because these platforms are owned by a few very rich and powerful men. They're based in the US, mostly, with the exception of TikTok. And they have aligned with MAGA in the US. And MAGA sees as its natural allies in Europe the far right, AfD in Germany, Reform Party in UK, the far right in every European country, basically. So, the propaganda of this far right, of course, relies a lot on disinformation about many topics. I said, Ukraine, climate change, migrants, LGBTQ+ communities, and so on. So disinformation about these topics will bring more consensus to the far right, that is the natural ally of MAGA, and will destroy, in the end, European democracies from within. So we are facing an unprecedented challenge, not just as fact-checkers, but as citizens, as Europeans. And I'm not in the business, of optimism, of pessimism. I'm in the business of now we need to fight back. Now it's time for the resistance. We need to speak to everyone, to the common people, to the institutions, to media, anyone, about the threat we are facing, what's going to happen in 5-10 years of exposure of our public opinions to unchallenged disinformation going viral on the platforms where the people inform themselves, because they're not looking at media anymore. They inform themselves on social media platforms. So we need regulation badly. DSA, it's something. It's not the best, of course, but it's something. And who wants to destroy DSA? Who's saying, let's get rid of DSA, otherwise we will retaliate, because DSA is basically tariffs, it's taxation on US companies. It's America, it's the United States, our former ally, and now we perceive that as a threat. These are, new times, new water we are trying to say it, and it's scary as hell. But we need to energize ourselves. We need to be very clear about what's happening. We need to spread awareness so we can start having strategies to fight against these new threats and preserve our democracies. Thank you.
Thank you, Tommaso. Jakub, same question for you. Jakub coming from Poland, from Pravda, and actually from European fact-checking community, and he works a lot about election in EU. He created wonderful data, so we will talk later about that.
Yeah, so maybe to bring some facts to the discussion about, I think, what are the threats and what are the dangers. So first of all, of course, it's looking at, let's say, meta decision is, of course, it's a big financial aspect. But I think we are trying to raise that there is also another part that's been attacked, which is the scale of our operations. So scalability of what we did. So, we always knew that there is this disproportion. There is disinformers and fact-checkers, and disinformers have their own echo chambers audience, and we fact-checkers often ask ourselves questions: do we reach the people who are spreading the fake news, or do we reach others and start polarizing? And I always saw, and I think that was the consensus, that the program was at least a way for us sometimes to escape the bubble, to reach to these communities and get out of the echo chamber. So I think looking at some of the dangers and threats and maybe some questions that we'll need to strategize about is how do we want to bring back the scalability? And I have to totally agree that this is the impulse to again discuss about collaborations, yes? I personally work in European fact-checking standards network, but also because of my other activities, I also seen the amazing work that EDMO is doing, that we also do on global level, and IFC, and so that's where I'm going to look for support, and again trying to to push for the cause and to show that fact-checking is an important weapon in the battles against disinformation.
Thank you, Jakub. Dear Carlos, please, floor is yours.
Thanks a lot for the invitation, Janan. The only thing that I really regret is not being able to be today with you guys physically in Pristina. But I have a very young baby. That's limiting my ability to move for the time being. Also great to share the stage, obviously, with good friends like Tommaso and Jacob. Let me just say that I agree with everything my colleagues just said. I think we are definitely under attack. When not would be a good question, because we have been obviously, people don't really like for other people to tell them they are lying on purpose. And so we have been kind of the focus of some attacks for quite some time. But at the same time, I think it's important to see that right now we are facing an attack that is very consistent by people who has a lot of resources, money, power, influence, and they are having this kind of three-front attack on fact-checking. That could be probably summarized as the people saying disinformation is not a problem, which, believe it or not, is a more common argument that we are hearing these days. I think it's hard to reconcile that with the reality we see. I think disinformation is not only an incredibly big problem for democracies, public health, and many other areas. It's also pretty evident in the harm it's creating. But still, many people are arguing that. The other group would be those who say fact-checking is not a solution. And let me say that it's not the solution. That is for sure. We can actually assert that there is no single magic silver bullet that will end the problem of disinformation. It will not happen. But fact-checking has been proven time and time again to be super effective at, making people rethink sometimes some of their assumptions, not to fall in obvious lies and manipulation. So I think that part is important. And then the third group is the one that we are probably going to spend the most time talking in the coming years, which is the guys who say any action against disinformation and fact-checking itself amounts to censorship, which is, for me, the most dangerous argument, even if it's completely false, because fact-checking really is counter speech. We don't want, and fact-checking organizations have never, ever wanted to remove discourse online, except in very specific circumstances. When there is, if we find child porn online, as any other citizen, we would like for that to be removed because that involves children. But for disinformation, for things that claims that are untrue, what fact-checkers have been advocating for years is not to delete or to remove, is to actually add more information, to have labels, to have warnings. So when people, ends up in a YouTube video with 2 million views that is actively saying that you should not believe your doctor and you should not go through chemotherapy when you have cancer, well, it could be good if they can see also a warning saying, okay, but there are several medical societies that say otherwise. That is kind of the ideal thing. So I think it's definitely under attack, and our challenges for this 2025 is how to respond to that attack when the other side, we can say, have a lot of resources at their disposal to basically attack us in any way possible, to try to defund our work, to try to make us less impactful. So we have to find ways to be more impactful. And let's be completely clear. For example, if the Meta program ends in Europe, we're gonna quickly see around 38 million labels of fact-checking that are gonna disappear every 6 months, which means that there are 38 million more opportunities for people to fall for scams or to be manipulated through misinformation. So I think it's a big challenge, but I could warn against any kind of defeatism. Like, fact-checking organizations are going to have a hard time. Some of them are, from one day to the other, seeing 80% of the revenue or the funds that they used to pay salaries and do their job disappear. That is a tough challenge. Not everyone is going to survive, but fact-checking as a whole is thriving and is alive and is going to survive. And fact-checkers were not doing their work because of Meta or because of any other digital platforms. Fact-checking organizations were here before and will be here after. So for me, the key focus in the challenges of fact-checking is how we serve the people better and how we kind of reinvent ourselves when we are facing this attack to not only survive, but actually thrive and be even more useful to our audiences, particularly for the audiences that do not naturally read fact-checking or consume any media. For those people who, have only a casual relationship with the news, but very often they have this information on their timelines if they consume content on digital platforms, as Tommaso was mentioning. So I think that is our key challenge for the time being. How do we overcome this well-funded, well-thought, highly effective attack on the work we do, and how we ensure that under that attack, we not only survive, but thrive and are even more effective and more useful to the people, which is, I think, at the end goal of every fact-checking organization there is in Europe and globally.
Thank you so much, Carlos. And I would like to continue with Jakub, because you make a big data about the election of EU. Could you tell a little bit more about that and which interferences are attacking our democracy, Western democracy, especially from China more or from Russia?
Yeah, so to give maybe background, so the project was project that was run by European Fact-Checking Standards Network, which invited members of our organization to basically share our work, so mostly fact checks and debunks and as well pre-banking materials that we have in a more standardized way. So, we work with, I think, over 30 different countries, even more languages. So, but at the end of the day, the work we do is pretty similar, so maybe we can leverage the fact that we verify similar claims, which are repeating in multiple countries, and we can try to share the knowledge. So that was the goal of the project, is to help fact-checkers basically do research faster, get more context, and as well, build some sort of a community to support the ongoing fact-checking work. Regarding the interference, I think when we look back at the results and looking at narratives and looking at the work that other fact-checkers did and the reports they wrote, maybe it's not an ideal answer, but to be honest, we did not see a large scale, and looking at the reports we saw when members created big narratives that were targeting European as whole. Of course, you have repeating narratives that were targeting, but to be honest, these elections, European elections, so the goal of the aim of the project mostly focused on national issues, national politics. To be honest, we did not see Chinese interference. I do not remember any instance where our members reported that they see a very clear influence. It's also very sometimes hard to prove this information, because to prove this information you have to prove intention, and that sometimes requires more investigative work, and fact checkers often see the content that is part of this disinformation campaign, yes, which might be spread due to the misinformation or accidental, etc., etc. So we did not see big campaigns, but of course narratives are still very similar and can be traced back to what is the goal of the Russian Kremlin.
Yeah, of course. Thank you. Maybe a very short introduction, what EFCSN is, right? So, of course, as fact checkers, we have this very delicate role of saying, okay, this is demonstrably false. So we receive always the question, okay, but why should we trust you? Who controls you? Who pays you? So we created an association with very strict codes, with very high standards about transparency, methodology, ethics, and so on. EFCSN is the most advanced that we have. It's in Europe. It has a European scope, and it's democratically elected. This is a very quick introduction. About the thing of, not witnessing major disinformation operations before the EU election, that's true. I mean, that was definitely a good sign. I think that the level of readiness and awareness helped in preventing the worst case scenarios. But on the other hand, let's not be mistaken. This is not how disinformation works. It's not, a few major booms before the elections. It's like the drop that excavates the rock year after year after year. And we had 10 years of disinformation, at least, from Russia, from domestic actors, from politicians, even from some media, that created a lot of damages in the public opinion of Europe, and this was clearly reflected in the result of the elections. So I think that disinformation had a major impact on EU elections, not just with the few major cases before the vote, but for the never-ending hammering of disinformation narratives through false content, demonstrably false content, day after day, even stupid ones, even the things that are clearly false, but create a feeling in the mind, shape the opinions of the people, and in the end they vote according to that opinions. So this is why it's really dangerous.
Yeah, totally agree, and also it's important. What we saw is we are looking for articles and fact checks collecting in the database which were targeting, let's say, things that are important for Europe and European Union. It's over 8 months, over 3,000 articles from around 30 organizations. And I have to agree, distrust in institutions, in governments, especially related to public health, total, let's say, disengagement from any kind of climate policies, and this polarization. This could be seen, but it's not major campaign. It's not maybe something that can be placed in a very important report showing, the connections, the networks, etc., etc. But it's still very dangerous. So it's...
Yeah, Carlos?
Yeah, I could add to that if you take a look at the way disinformation campaigns and foreign interference have been evolving through the years, yeah, obviously from time to time you will see completely manufactured campaigns where there is these entities in Russia, China, or anywhere else that are actually creating the content, the original content, and trying to disseminate it. That still happens, but I think it's less and less often. I think these networks and these sometimes they are inauthentic, sometimes they are comprised of users that have some interest in common with those countries. They have probably learning that it is much more worth of their time and effort to amplify local narratives and disinformation that is already occurring than actually creating disinformation campaigns from scratch. So this is something that we have seen in the past, in which these Russian aligned networks, for example, have been amplifying local disinformers. Why? Because the people producing this information, the ones that you already know probably in your country, they are very much connected to your local and national reality, and they are honestly much better at creating these hoaxes and these disinformation campaigns, and they are much more compelling and realistic and frankly much more difficult to spot than disinformation campaigns that are created in some institute in St. Petersburg, Russia, right? So I think their tactics and techniques have been changing through the years, and I think right now foreign actors and rogue actors are probably focusing more on finding ways to empower narratives that are beneficial to them in the sense that they are eroding democratic institutions, for example, in Western Europe, rather than doing the other way around. So I have seen this in several countries, instances where, you know, they would favor content that is misinformation that has been created by a local party. So I think we need to be aware that the larger battle in FIMI and, you know, foreign manipulation, it's more in the, as it has been mentioned, at the narrative level. Like these foreign actors that run these information campaigns clearly don't care that much about the individual hoax. They care about constantly transmitting, you know, as Tomás was saying, constantly transmitting an idea that is based on falsehood, that is much more, you know, much stronger than any individual piece of this information that they can actually run. It's a longer project and longer term, and it never ends. And I think that is something that we all need to take into account when talking about modern.
Thank you, Carlos. Any question, please?
Hybrid.
No?
I can take the occasion to actually say a few words about this, because this technique about narratives is very smart. Okay. Because what we, at least in ADMO, for example, we define as disinformation narrative is the clear message that emerges from a consistent set of content that is demonstrably false with the fact-checking methodology. So, you know, doctored picture, deep fake video, statement that is factually wrong. All these specific content, they all send the same message. For example, I don't know, again, Ukrainians are Nazis. The problematic part is that sometimes it can happen that this narrative can also be a legitimate opinion. So, for example, Muslim migrants are not compatible with Western European countries. This is a disinformation narrative. We have seen endless amount of content sending this message clearly. False statements, wrong numbers, images from one part of the world said like they were about Europe and so on. But it's also, even if I personally find it despicable, it is a legitimate political opinion. So when disinformation push narratives, maybe they're also pushing some people's opinions. And so when you try to expose these narratives, the people that share their opinions immediately say, oh, come on, this is censorship of my opinion. But we are not talking about the opinions. We are talking about the facts, the wrong fact, the demonstrably false content that was spread across years of hammering of disinformation that shaped those opinions. So the tactic is smart. We need to be as smart, if not more possibly, in our response.
Jacob, would you like to say something for that?
No, I think, you know, Tomás and what Edmo is doing is they are masters of narratives. So I think they exactly understand this. You know, I think it's very important what Tomás said is that demonstrable with fact-checking methodology. So it's basically trying to answer what do we do and how our work is, you know, viewed. Very often we get a lot of this kind of, I don't know, whether questions or allegations or different negative comments. We look, and we are part of this whole anti-disinformation warfare. We look at the content. We are on the front lines, yes. We see things that people post. We try to assess the impact. We have our own methodologies how to choose it, which has a lot of biases, unfortunately. Platforms are not helping us to have a good, you know, methodology to select good sample of things that we should fact check. But at the end of the day, we are looking at individual statements. Very often people are saying that we are verifying whether a politician is a truthful person, or we are not looking at politicians, we are looking at their statement. That's what we do, especially in Pravda, and my colleagues at least from Poland. We always focus on the information in order so that, let's say, during the elections, people who choose can form their opinions based on facts. And that's our goal. So I think just to remember what I think fact-checking, what is the role of fact-checking in this whole ecosystem. At least that's my opinion here.
Carlos, something for the end?
Yeah, I definitely think that the work of fact-checkers have been evolved through the years. Like, we are obviously on the front lines, which is a very interesting work, because what we do, as Jacob has been explaining, we monitor what people is talking about, and we receive from those same people, our communities in our countries, like a lot of information about things that are getting viral, about things that are confusing people, about things that are making some people think if they are true or not. And we investigate those and find the evidence and reach conclusions, basically. I also think like that kind of ground level work of actually seeing what people is asking about and finding whether or not those claims have any basis in reality, that establishes a ground of evidence that is useful for anyone studying this information. Like when researchers, in universities or somewhere else, they are trying to understand how people react to this information, they don't start looking, looking for this information themselves. What they do is actually rely on the work of fact-checking organizations that have already established a big data set of things that are untrue and formats that people pushing this information normally uses, and characteristics of the way the language works when you are transmitting this information, that kind of thing. So I think in that sense, fact-checking is super useful for the space. And then the work of the fact-checking organizations have become so diverse over the years. And because they do fact-checking and they understand how, what are the lies people are deceived by, they are very effective at doing media literacy programs, for example. Because they are doing that monitoring, they are also very adept at finding networks and understanding how that content gets shared and if that content gets amplified artificially. They are also very knowledgeable about how the policies and the implementation of those policies in the different digital platforms affect this information or not. Honestly, there is no one I trust more than fact-checking organizations to say, okay, these policies by TikTok or Facebook or whatever, are they working or not? Fact-checkers normally know that before anyone else because they can see whether or not, the impact of this information in those services is being actively curtailed or not by the policies of the platform. So I think fact-checking organizations have become, much more relevant in many areas beyond pure fact-checking over the years, and also in their capacity to identify foreign interference and the people pushing that narratives, trying to find out whether or not they're acting coordinatedly. All that, I think, it's part of the evolution of fact-checking over the years.
Thank you so much. Thank you, all of you. And thank you for attention. I think, Tommaso, we need coffee now, and Jakob, more Zubrovka. Thank you so much. Coffee break.
Thank you, Gunan, for having us.
Thank you. Thank you for the invitation. Next time, I need to be there.